I'm Julie Roginsky here with Olga Lautman. Welcome to our kind of off-schedule active measures episode, chapter four.
Five.
Four this year, actually, isn't it? About the
Five.
Nazis. Five.
Five.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, we
Um,
already wrote 5 chapters.
about this time about the Nazis and the Kremlin and Trump and how they all intersected to get Donald Trump elected in 2016. Want to just remind folks why we're doing this. Olga and I did not really plan to revisit the 2016 election because, why would you revisit the 2016 election? But we had no choice but to revisit it because, as you recall, Donald Trump about a month ago, he came out and basically said that no, in fact, he was not um, taking any responsibility for the Kremlin interfering in 2016. It was a big hoax. The Russia hoax. The whole thing was a hoax. And Olga and I said, well, you know what? We're going to have to set the record straight here. The mainstream media is absolutely not setting the record straight. The mainstream media is sitting there saying, on the one hand, people are saying that Russia interfered, but on the other hand, Donald Trump is saying it was a hoax. So why don't we let people decide for themselves? There's nothing to decide here. It's not like on the one hand, the earth is flat, and the other hand, the earth is round. Let's have a fair and balanced debate. Russia did interfere in 2016. Russia continues to interfere. And I want to, Olga, before we get to this chapter today about the Nazis and the Kremlin and Trump, I want to just talk very briefly, a bit off topic to this particular chapter, but not off topic about what was happening in Russian interference more generally. There was a terrible school shooting yesterday in Minneapolis. And I wish I could say this shocks the conscience, like Columbine shocked the conscience back in 1999. But since Columbine, we have had so many of these school shootings that they don't even make the front page anymore. It just happens. Yesterday, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old died while praying in church. This was at a Catholic school in Minneapolis. The mayor of Minneapolis, I thought, had a very good line about this, which he said, I don't want to hear about your thoughts and prayers. These kids were literally praying as they were gunned down. And they were praying as they were gunned down. So if thoughts and prayers were able to save people, these kids would have been saved. But in fact, 20 of them were injured. 2 of them are dead. And I think a few others are in very, very perilous conditions at the moment. So I want to talk about why we're bringing this up today, is that this alleged gunman, um, if you look at the New York Post today, and if you look at right-wing media, they're making a very big deal out of the fact that this alleged gunman was a trans woman, and I guess a gun woman. And that's become kind of the right-wing talking point about the fact that she's a trans woman. That's not what's relevant here. Because if you're going to make this about trans people, let's just remember that 99.9% of the school shootings are conducted by white boys and men. So I don't think you can pin this one on the trans community.
No.
But what you can do is talk about the thing that the media is not covering again, that I think you should talk about, because if you want to talk about how Russia brainwashes Americans, this is Exhibit A. Olga, why don't you talk about what else was found at this shooter's house, on the shooter's person? What else is happening?
Yeah, so this actually is something I'm scratching my head because the media is covering every single aspect of it, except mentioning that he wrote his ramblings or manifesto, whatever you want to call it, that there were pages fully in Russian, that the magazine clips, on top of all the other racist and hateful and vile and, reprehensible things, that there were things written in Russian. AP came the closest to it, where they actually mentioned that there were many items where they said it was Cyrillic handwriting. I read the words, I read the pages. I mean, this is Russian. I don't understand why we need to hide behind Cyrillic. This is not Ukrainian language. These aren't Ukrainian words. These aren't Belarusian words. This is Russian. Now, to why we're mentioning it today is that Russia, for, I would say the past decade, and it became even more prevalent after the full scale invasion, that they have been indoctrinating people online. And I've actually recommended to people, that if you want to combat their disinformation and their information warfare operations, you really need to dust off the, playbook on how US and European officials dealt with terrorist organizations, indoctrinating people and then carrying, um, priming them to carry out violent acts. And here you have Russia, climbing everywhere. Discord, Telegram, um, Facebook, Twitter. I mean, you name it, they're on these platforms. They're seeking vulnerable people or, people who have mental health issues or, whatever their vulnerabilities are. And they are targeting them. And the fact that you have a 20-something-year-old in Minneapolis who does not seem to have any background to Russia, writing in Russian, and, this wasn't even done through Google Translate, because it was handwritten notes, that you have him writing Russian phrases on magazines. What happened there? And I think this warrants an investigation and a look into, instead of, the MAGA focusing on the fact that it was a trans person. They should be focusing on what happened here, because if this was Ukrainian writing or any mention of anything Ukrainian, I can tell you that would be the talking point that they would be pushing.
I
And here, this is very problematic. I'll just wrap up quickly. That you have, I said since the full scale invasion, you have had Wagner recruiting people on Twitter, on, Discord, on various platforms to go fight Russia's genocidal war. You have them hiring people on, across Europe to carry out arson, sabotage operations in European cities. This is a very big problem, and the fact that they can get to our children and to indoctrinate our children, and over the past several years, it's not just been about polarizing and spreading disinformation. It is trending more towards having these people indoctrinated and then push them out to carry out acts of violence.
So what he wrote, apparently, on, or she wrote, on her weapon is the Russian word "nенависть," which means hatred. Um, and wrote it in Russian. Again, not in Cyrillic. No more than when you write in English, you write in Latin, in the sense that they use the Cyrillic alphabet the same way that we use Latin letters, they use Cyrillic letters, but we write in English and they write in Russian. So he wrote the word "ненависть," which is the Russian word for hatred.
Yeah,
Um,
terrorist,
terrorist.
which is I am a terrorist.
Right. And it sounds like it's a probable reference to the T-shirt that the 2018 Kirsch Polytechnic College shooter in Russia was wearing,
He
but not.
mentioned the Russian
Yeah,
shooter on
so
another
he
magazine.
mentioned the Russian shooter, but it's interesting that of all the shooters, this is the one that fascinated him. It's interesting that he was writing this in Russian, a language that, as far as I know, um, this person did not speak. Um, I mean, this is I'm going to refer to the shooter as she, because because she's a trans woman, but graduated from this kindergarten slash I think it was K through 8 school. Her mother taught at the school, so grew up in Minneapolis, does not have a Russian background. you gotta wonder where she got radicalized, and you gotta wonder what she was on to get radicalized, and you gotta wonder, of all the languages in all the world, why she was writing the word hatred in Russian, and what she was on, and, you know, when we think about motivation and we think about getting to the bottom of this, spare a moment for the fact that, there is a tremendous amount of Russian propaganda that is flowing to young kids and to teenagers and to young adults.
I can tell you during the 2020 election, my son, because he knows what I do, he always comes to check things with me, and I can't tell you how many times he asked, "Is Joe Biden a pedophile? Where did you get this? Instagram. Is Joe Biden this? Did he do that? Did he rape a woman?" I mean, this is at the time. I mean, this is what it was being pushed onto kids, through Instagram, through Snapchat, through Discord, which they use for their, even through PlayStation and Xbox message boards. I mean, this is a very big problem that Americans have not even close to gotten a handle of, because if you see the impact it's had on American adults, can you imagine where they are, you know, indoctrinating kids? And kids, not every kid has that, to go to their parents and say, "Is this true? Is this true? Can I fact check with
Yeah.
you?"
And look, the journal, was written in Cyrillic script, again in Russian, um, published in a YouTube video, which I think has been taken down since, underscores the desire for infamy, but again, written in Russian. And you don't just wake up one day and write things in Russian if you don't speak the Russian language and you don't have a connection
And
to
it's
Russia.
not
It's
an
not an easy
easy.
it's not an easy language, and again, it's not even like Spanish or French where they're using the same letters that we use. I mean, this is a completely different alphabet. And so I think it merits more investigation as to exactly what kind of propaganda the shooter was receiving and from whom before the shooting. But I also think it's important for our media to maybe focus on that a little bit more than on the fact that this person is trans, because again, uh, the fact that this person is trans may have been relevant to whatever pain and suffering she went through. Obviously, it's not an easy situation, especially these days, to be trans. But I think much more relevant to the larger issue of what this all means is why this person was writing things in Russian in a journal on weapons and in other places, posting on YouTube. It's just it's something that I think the media needs to do a better job of figuring out and getting to the bottom of. All right, speaking of,
And just to
yeah,
add one last thing, I mean, this is extremely serious because we had, what was it, a year and a half ago, a case where, you had a army official on Discord who got recruited and indoctrinated and being
yeah,
pushed orthodox stuff and whatnot, and ended up handing over America's secrets
yeah,
to to the Russians via Discord. So I mean,
yeah.
big problem.
It is not hard to radicalize somebody who's already mentally unwell. And if you are somebody who opens fire on little children at a Catholic school while they're praying, you are clearly mentally unwell. And so that's no surprise. That's no surprise. Um, if you are full of anger and hate already, which you must be to be able to go and do something like this, it is not hard for somebody to come along and manipulate you and radicalize you. And that is exactly what the Russians do so well. But not just the Russians, also, Olga, which brings us to this week's topic. Also, hate groups, also neo Nazis. You don't wake up one day and become a neo Nazi unless you were raised on it by your parents, or if you were easily manipulated and radicalized. And that's what we want to talk about this week, as to what the Kremlin did in advance of the 2016 election to create symbiosis between their nationalists, their white supremacists, their neo Nazis and neo fascists, and our own domestic neo-Nazis and neo-fascists. It is, again, a deeply undercovered element of the 2016 election. And Olga and I keep kind of joking that once we're done with all of this in the next couple of months, however long it's going to take us to do one of these a week, we probably should just compile this into a book because I don't think this has ever been written before as to exactly how deeply and how methodically and how thoughtfully the Russians manipulated every single aspect of American society, from the gun rights people to the evangelicals to the media to now the week that we're talking about here to the Nazis, to talk about how they were able to convert those people into proselytizers for not just the Republicans, but for specifically Donald Trump's candidacy. Because to the extent that everybody said in the Mueller report, or the Mueller report said, Olga, that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, but they didn't draw conclusions as to whether it was on behalf of Donald Trump, that's pretty hilarious. Certainly wasn't on behalf of Hillary Clinton, but
No.
even before Trump got the nomination, it was very much on behalf of Donald Trump. Because there were two other candidates, and specifically one other candidate towards the end who was in competition with Trump. Not real competition, but it had come down, as you remember, to Trump and to Ted Cruz. By every barometer, Ted Cruz was much more in line with where traditional right-wing Republican base voters were, right? From the evangelical perspective, church-going guy, married to one wife, children from one wife, lived, from what we can tell, kind of a blameless life. Whether he's religious or not, I don't know, but he certainly puts on the act. Trump, thrice divorced. Um, if you were anywhere around Donald Trump for the last 40 years, you know exactly what he acted like and behaved like. I mean, this is not a man of God by any stretch of the imagination. And yet they all lined up for him. And we traced yesterday as to how Russia ensured that was going to happen, as opposed to Ted Cruz. Well, this time, you had Russians influencing people like Richard Spencer, who I don't know that people are aware of Richard Spencer. You should. Richard Spencer was one of the most prolific neo-Nazis around of the last generation. He has since been bankrupted by two powerhouse women, one of whom is a woman named Karen Dunn, one of whom is a woman named Robbie Kaplan, who took on the case of the victims, the survivors of the Charlottesville um, massacre, which is what it turned into when a woman died. But that whole Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville sued Richard Spencer and a whole bunch of other neo-Nazis and civilly and bankrupted them, which is fantastic. But until then, Richard Spencer was deeply influential. Richard Spencer, Olga, you could take it away, married to a Russian woman, spent a lot of time in Russia, very much under the influence of the Kremlin, very much going out there and saying that you are a self-hating white person if you vote for anybody but Donald Trump in the primary. So why don't you go ahead and discuss the background between the Kremlin, Richard Spencer, David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and others. Why don't you go ahead and kick that off?
So basically, this week we focused on it, and we began actually with Putin when he was serving as a KGB officer in Dresden. And one of his, uh, asked was to recruit a neo-Nazi to send him to West Germany at the time, and he was his handler. So we begin there, and we kind of walk through to show how Russia used, these ultra nationalists inside the country and, outside these movements. To basically turn into another weapon of Russia's intelligence services. And this is exactly what it is. Now, you have these neo-Nazis and these white supremacists. I mean, these are weapons filled with vile hate, and they're very easy to push. So Russia, formed alliances naturally with them. You had David Duke, who moved to Russia in the 90s. He started associating with Alexander Dugin, who is one of the fascist, um, I would say, one of the most fascist people who has this very warped vision of, what the world should look like. So they, how you call it, David Duke, created an alliance. He had such an impact inside of Russia that his book was translated into Russian, and sold at the Duma bookstore, which is Russia's parliament. Then from there, you had Richard Spencer, who, his ex-wife was the translator for Alexander Dugin. She herself was running around, with all these fascist Russian, thinkings, pushing them through American circles. You had Spencer, who was intertwined with Alexander Dugin, inviting him to do online seminars and whatnot. And at the same time, in around 2000, I believe 11, Russia basically Russia's security services through someone living in Moscow, um, opened up an online forum which collected all the neo-Nazi and white supremacist organizations around the globe. And here, this forum was so violent that, I mean, they discussed really committing various acts of violence and sharing violent acts that had already happened. Um, they ended up, one of the groups was Adam Waffen, which they were responsible for carrying out murders in the US. So you had this forum, and as with everything else, and why we started with what happened in Minneapolis, before it was just for information warfare. But then after this forum went offline in 2017, it was called Iron March. After this forum went, it kind of, came back in a different format. And this was through a group called The Base, which pretty much mimics Al Qaeda, which translates to the base, which is the terrorist organization. And the base is basically like this group of extremists that Russia was bringing some members to St. Petersburg to go through paramilitary training camps and then to send them out to carry out acts of violence. This group actually recently, for anyone who watches our Pax Americana, we've brought this group up a few times because they now have become extremely emboldened in U.S., being that Kash Patel has basically sidelined, looking into any domestic terrorist organizations, and they have increased their recruiting to carry out assassinations and sabotage operations in Ukraine. So you see, even with via the Nazi route, how had been trending just from from information warfare to actually now carrying out operations, violent operations, and how all of these groups together were instrumental and in getting Trump elected. They were the ones who pushed for him. And over the past few weeks, we have shown that Russia used the NRA, Russia used the evangelicals, Russia used the neo Nazis, and each piece built more and more support for Trump. I mean, these are normally, whole groups that wouldn't have necessarily voted for the one person, but here they were all pushing that Donald Trump is the chosen one.
And, I want to just talk about the symbiosis here because it's pretty startling. So, everybody talks about Ukraine as something that just showed up 3 years ago. In fact, the whole full scale invasion began a few years ago. But Ukraine is something that Putin has wanted back for decades. And the initial attack on Ukraine, as we know, began over a decade ago in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Well, in 2013, a man named Andrew Anglin, who's obviously American, launched something called the Daily Stormer. If you remember your history, you know that Der Stürmer was something that was the Nazis' newspaper in Munich that helped the rise of Adolf Hitler and was the kind of Pravda equivalent of the Nazi regime. So the Daily Stormer is not a coincidence. It became the neo-Nazi command post of the Trump era, just to be clear. It hailed Trump as our glorious leader. It amplified Kremlin propaganda and NATO, and Ukraine and globalism, quote unquote, which is a code word, of course, for Jews. And it cast Putin as the defender of the white race. Um, you know, as Putin was specifically positioning Russia as the conservative alternative to the liberal, decadent, corrupt West, Anglin and his writers of the Daily Stormer, they routinely praised Putin as a defender of Christianity and quote unquote European identity. And in their view, Russia represented the modern Byzantium and represented the antidote to feminism, to LGBTQ rights, to multiculturalism, to pluralism, all the things that the Daily Stormer's readers despised. And in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed it, and began fueling the conflict in eastern Ukraine, uh, you know, Western governments, and Obama was still in power back then, condemned these actions as a violation of international law. But the Daily Stormer amplified the narratives that portrayed Russia as the rightful protector of Crimea and Ukrainians of Russian descent. And so that's where you have the symbiosis beginning. And then Trump comes along and they amplify that symbiosis. And then you have somebody like David Duke, who had spent the previous 20 years excuse me, somebody just came to my house, the previous 20 years living in Russia, kind of coinciding with the rise of Vladimir Putin. He moves to Moscow. He spends a lot of time with Dugin, spends a lot of time hobnobbing, as Olga mentioned. His book is sold at the Duma bookstore, which is just amazing. I mean, could you imagine the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan's book being sold in the halls of Congress? I guess maybe now you can, but under normal circumstances, hard to believe. He wrote effusively about Russia, wrote effusively about Putin, and his book was actually called My Awakening, but translated into Russian and sold in the Russian Parliament bookstore, it was actually called The Jewish Question Through the Eyes of an American. Well, what is the Jewish question? What does that remind you of? Right? That's exactly out of Nazi propaganda. The Jewish, the final solution to the Jewish problem, the Jewish question. This is something Nazis were always very concerned about. Now that's being sold in the Russian parliament. And, what that means is that then he comes back to the United States and he starts promulgating on behalf of Trump. And he gave this quote during the primaries where he said, I'm going to read this directly, saying, voting for these people, talking about Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, voting against Donald Trump at this point really is treason to your heritage. When asked to disavow Duke, Trump wavered and said that he didn't know, quote unquote, anything about David Duke, which is complete and utter bullshit because Trump had been a member of a political party to which David Duke had belonged 20 years ago, and he left that party saying specifically he did not want to be aligned with David Duke. He knew exactly who David Duke was. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, David Duke was not helpful to Donald Trump. By 16, he was very helpful to Donald Trump, so Trump said he didn't really know who he was. And you have this kind of symbiosis of the Russians manipulating David Duke. Richard Spencer, who is, as Olga mentioned, married to Dugin's translator, also promulgating Russian talking points. And that's how they infiltrated the neo-Nazis. And that is what led to all of those neo-Nazis lining up, not behind Ted Cruz, who made a lot more sense for conservatives, but behind Donald Trump. Now, you may say it's because Cruz is Cuban. I don't think so. I think it's because the Kremlin was desperately trying to get Trump in. They knew who it was that they wanted in, and they used these. I don't even think they're useful idiots. Some of them, like David Duke, were actual they collaborated. Collaborators. And that's what you're seeing. That's what you're seeing. And just to end things where we started it, it continues because now they're using very vulnerable children and young adults, radicalizing them on social media. And now you have dead children in Minneapolis. I don't know whether there was a direct correlation, but all I know is that it's very strange for somebody to be writing in Russian on their weapons and in their journal who's from Hennepin County, Minnesota. Just not, Olga and I speak Russian, and I don't think I write in Russian in my journal. or in a journal
No.
page. I don't have a journal, but if I did, it would not be in Russian. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's just very strange. So, on that note, please
And
go
just
back.
I want to
Yeah.
add one tiny thing.
Yep.
Um, yeah, people in the West, call Alexander Dugin Putin's whisperer, and they have all these weird, ridiculous, like Putin's
Yes.
Rasputin, whatever thoughts. The more important thing to remember is that Dugin's writings are mandatory reading in Russia's military. So this is, I think, more important than whether he's whispering to Putin because Putin has many whisperers. The fact that his writings, his tactics, are used as part of Russia's Ministry of
Yeah.
Defense and its mandatory readings in Russia's military, who carry out information warfare operations, who organize these paramilitary groups, who recruit people from abroad to bring for training for these paramilitary groups and whatnot. So I think this is, that's the final point I wanted to make because every time I read someone mentioning Dugan in Western media, I laugh. I'm like, what is this whisperer? I mean, like this is a little bit drop more serious than a whisperer, if you
Yeah.
ask me.
And, again, to be clear, this is like a feedback loop, right? You have Russian media, Russian interests, Russian propaganda boosting these white nationalists here online through the Internet Research Agency, which, of course, was the troll farm outside St. Petersburg that was launching all of these attacks. And in turn, these groups amplify pro Russian, pro Trump propaganda. Um,
And the last one, for
yeah.
anyone who didn't read our last week's, Alexander Dugin is also a key figure to the evangelical and traditional values and the Orthodox, community. So he's an intersection between neo-Nazi and this with, frankly, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, I mean, it literally was carried out
Yeah.
by both he called these little green men, which were paramilitary special forces. And you had this intersection between orthodoxy and between these neo Nazis, as Russia used one of their neo Nazi groups. They sent them to Eastern Ukraine to carry out
Yep.
and fight.
So we thank everybody for joining. If you want much, much, much more detail on this, please go to our Substacks. It's on both Olga's and my Substack. We both published the same column on Monday talking about this. We will be back next week. I think, Olga, next week we're going to tackle a chapter on how the Russians infiltrated right-wing media because they certainly did. And I can tell you, as somebody who worked at Fox News for a long time, they certainly were effective in getting their points across. But it's not just that. I mean, it's the online right wing that's really become very, very, very prevalent, especially with young men, especially with young
Yeah.
men. And if you want to know why young men are radicalized, and, we talked about how a lot of them commit atrocious acts of violence. Don't sleep on the fact that Russia was very much involved in that as well. So we'll be back with that next Monday on Substack. And next Tuesday, we will see you back here. There is a Labor Day protest, I believe, happening. There are Labor Day protests happening. Be safe if you're going out there and doing that. Be safe generally. And we thank everybody for joining us for this week's Active Measure Substack Live. Thank you so much for reading this last week's chapter. I don't think I've gotten that much viewership, at least on my Substack, and anything I've ever written. I mean, tens of thousands of you have been following the series, which we're so deeply grateful to you. Please, please, please spread it around, not because we necessarily want people to read our stuff, but because we just think as many people that need to know about this should know about this. And that means all of us, not just here in the United States, but especially those of you also living abroad. It's not just here. It's coming to your countries too. If Olga and I had 48 hours in a day and not 24 hours in a day, we'd do a whole separate one on French active measures and British active measures and Italian
German.
active, German active measures. But unfortunately, there's only so much time and we live in the United States. Hopefully somebody in your own countries can do this. If you need help, call us. We'll walk you through what to look for. Yeah.
Last thing before we go. Uh, we are launching a disinformation warfare, information warfare seminar and tactics to combat disinformation. The seminar begins September 17th. I'm sorry, September 17th. It will be on a Zoom link. This is offered to our paid subscribers of either Julie or my Substacks, and it's going to be a 6-week course basically on all the tactics that Russia is using, how the far right in the US is using pretty much copied these tactics, where they intersect, and most importantly, what can we do to counter it? What measures have been taken in Estonia or Ukraine and other countries that have been more successful in countering the spread of disinformation and propaganda? There's a registration link, either of our Substacks, and you could register, and then we'll send the link for the actual Zoom meeting the morning of September 17th.
Yes, and, I know there are questions about people being at work and not being able to join. For our paid subscribers, we will put this out on Substack so you can actually, um, be able to access it if you can't join live, and be able to read it. So we are so or watch it. We are very, very deeply grateful to all of you for doing this. Thank you so much for joining us. Almost 430 people on right now, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is
Yeah.
pretty good. And as I said, tens of thousands of you who read and watch this series online. So we're very, very grateful to you as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.